recording, which is exciting. So on that, okay, we've got a couple more people to let in here. Give it just a moment. Okay, so welcome Irish Genealogy Club members to your meeting hosted virtually by the Dowling Library. I'm your hostess, Jennifer Drennan, librarian of the Dowling Library. And with us today from Santa Cruz, am I right, Jean?
I am. I do live in Santa Cruz, but actually I'm coming to you from Eureka, California with I'm with my youngest daughter and her husband and our new grandson, Dean Patrick.
Oh, congratulations. That's
Thank
exciting.
You. Yeah.
So Jean is with us live to talk about the story of her book and the research project. And we will, honest, no fingers, cross my heart, we will be sharing this later. So with that, Jean, welcome. Thank you for presenting and take it away.
Okay, great. I'm glad to see all your faces, and someday we'll meet up there in person. I actually grew up in the Sunset District on 42nd and Ulloa, and I'm a native San Franciscan. So I'm happy to be sharing the story of my book with you. Today I'm going to tell you about my ancestors going back to 1850, and I want to share with you a list of my sources because I was thinking that since you're the Irish Genealogy Club, you're probably interested in knowing your own family stories. So I wanted to tell you how I got the information to go about writing this book. And here's the book, and you can see it on the slideshow as well. But it's called Brave Hearts, a San Francisco Story, The Grit and Dreams of an Irish Immigrant Family. And at the end, actually next week, I will publish a list of the websites that I've used, and I'll give you those later this coming week. But right now I'll begin the slideshow, and I want to tell you that I'll be reading two stories, and my daughter Katie Sanchez, she's actually in Panama right now, and she'll be reading one of the stories from the book to you as well. So here we go, and we'll begin the slideshow. So there you see the cover, and my can everybody see this? Thumbs up if you're good. You can see it. Okay. So my grandparents, Philip and Charlotte Lynch, are on the cover, and they got married in 1902 in San Francisco. And this is a picture of Market Street that's on the cover, and I believe it's from around that time. So we'll start with the slideshow. Emily, my daughter Emily is helping me. I need to forward it. Yeah, sorry. Okay.
So go on the arrow.
Okay. Oh, there we
That's
go.
how you're
Okay.
forward it.
So, as I said, I'm proud to be actually a fourth generation San Franciscan, and my book tells the story about my Irish ancestors and their history. I got both oral and written sources, and I wanted to tell you how I started. And I really listened and I searched beginning at the age of 9 years old, and I continued that search for over 60 years. I'm 70 years old now. As you can see here, my grandmother, Charlotte Lynch, and my mother, Barbara Mahoney, they're walking down the street shopping. And this was quite a common occurrence to have your picture taken by a photographer, and then they would send you the photos. But these were probably my main sources of information, and it was oral from my mother. But my grandmother, Charlotte, she's the older one. I actually think I kind of look like her. She saved a scrapbook that was invaluable to me, to keep the records. And as I said, my mother, Barbara, and her mother, Charlotte Lynch, they were storytellers, and they preserved the history, keeping mementos from their past. And here's my grandmother, Charlotte. She grew up in the Sacramento Delta. And in this picture here, you can see her. She's got what they call a brace of ducks that she and her husband actually hunted there. When they arrived, my ancestors arrived in the Delta as the European settlers. They actually found an incredible wealth of nature and the natural world. As we know, the Indians, the Native Americans, were there for 9,000 years, and they lived in more of a balance than my recent ancestors did. But also, my grandparents went into various states of having riches and then having nothing. So they knew how to hunt, and they would, hunt for their food. So anyway, the sources that I found, my picture's in the way, but this picture here is my grandmother saved a cookbook from her era, and it's from the Crisco cookbook. Now, when you look at cookbooks, you can see various things that reflect the times. In other words, these people had more of a wealth of opportunity in terms of venison, ducks, poultry, beef to cook from. They had more extended menus, and they were also had to cook. They didn't have a delivery service like we do, which we are fortunate to have right now. But my grandmother was quite a good cook. And this page I opened to is from her cakes um, part of the cookbook. And you can see it's all stained, and she made gold cake, hurry up cake, all kinds of cakes. So she was a very fine baker. She also saved little mementos from her childhood and early adulthood. And this is a dance card, and I had heard of dance cards, but I had never seen them. And this is from the Brentwood Farm Center. And if you open it up, you'll see, okay, waltz, foxtrot, da 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 da, and then the men would sign up for dances. And I was fascinated to see that she actually lived through those times. This one here, it's behind my screen of the pictures, but it's an article about when they owned a theater in San Francisco. So as I told you, my grandmother saved the San Francisco papers because that's where she was in her young adult and older life. And when I was 9 years old, my mom and dad left me alone, because I was 9, and that I was okay to do that. And I looked in the hall closet, and I found her scrapbook, and I opened it up, and she had actually saved this entire paper from 1902. This one's June 23rd, but the Point Reyes train wreck was on the solstice on the 21st of June. And they were in this train wreck. And when I was 9, I thought, wow, that's pretty impressive. I didn't, and obviously they lived through that. But you can see here, the car was actually tumbled upside down, and they were young enough that they did survive this train wreck. But she actually tells that, we were lucky. But what my point here is also that newspapers, both local and national, are an incredible source of reflection of the times. They had a more flowery style of writing back then. I believe they were as factual as can be. They didn't have radio and TV at that time. And so those were the places that they got facts, and those are easy for you to access. So I was really appreciative to have that. And also you can access them on the internet now. Newspapers.com, an incredible source of factual things. So at the beginning of the story of the book, it starts out with my Irish ancestors who came from the Great Famine. And I believe that I would say the majority of our Irish ancestors here in San Francisco, in the United States, came from various waves of the Great Famine. My first people came in 1850. I believe the first famine was in 1847, but here is a picture of the absolute poverty that the people went through. And here was this new continent they'd heard about. They could escape the terrible living conditions. When my wife and I went back to Ireland, one of my dad's cousins said, they had to eke out a living and they couldn't do it. And so they came to America. And if you are able to go back to Ireland, or if you have been, you'll be able to tune into that magic of the people and your ancestors there. But you can do it online now too. But what I wanted to tell you about the Great Famine is that research on this topic was through 3 main sources. My cousin Nancy was a wealth of information for me, and I was very lucky in that case. because she had done a lot of the legwork on the Irish genealogy. Now, people in Ireland in the various counties, they will give you sources. And I believe that they are as willing to share as anybody. So that's an excellent source, just the various counties of Ireland. And we were also lucky enough to visit Ireland several times, and visiting family or the places where your people lived, your grandparents, your great grandparents, and back and back and back, gives us the honor of being with our people that we just don't have here in America. And so I was privileged, and I hope you will be able to do that if you can. And if you can't, then you can talk like we are to them. And they love to hear from us. They really do. So what I did in the book, I took the privilege of using their voices and speaking in their voices. And Margaret Anson, Emily, how do I, can I ask people to, I'm sorry, my daughter Emily's here helping me. She's my techie. I wanted to show them the picture of Margaret, but my screen
They can
is
see
here.
it, you can't. It's okay.
Oh, they can see it. Oh, good, good, good.
differently
Okay,
than-
you guys can see it. So up in the upper right-hand corner is a picture of Margaret Anson, who's my great, great, great grandmother. And I wanted to write her story, and I knew the facts from my cousin Nancy. And I said to her, I looked up and I said, is this okay? Can I do this in your voice? And she said to me, it's all relative, dear. It's fine. And so I did that. And so I wanted to share with you a little bit of Margaret's story. And in the book, it's Margaret Fahey Anson, and she's going to speak from the year 1850 to you. And I'm just going to read a little bit of her story to you so you get the flavor of what I was having the privilege to do. Margaret Fahey Anson, 1850. Oh, leaving me homeland, well, that was a true test of me faith. I saw families in Cashel dying all around us. Oh, may their souls rest in peace. The potatoes we depended upon for our daily survival, well, they just died on the vine from blight, and famine it ravaged the villages. Both young and old, they died from starvation. Me 4 boys, me daughter and myself, well, we left out to America while we were still alive. A husband, Richard, he was already gone to an early grave. I knew me family had no hope anymore in me homeland. So we boarded the ship and we sailed away. Oh, it was for the hope of it all. Don't you see? Back in those years, we Irish had a saying, there's hope from the sea, but there's no hope from the grave. I saw me dear husband die the year before I left me homeland forever. But me firstborn Patrick, he was safe in America, in a place called St. Louis. Just knowing that Patrick was safe and thriving with the money he'd saved to send back to us for our passage, well, that was enough to steal myself away, and I just let Ireland go. I left me homeland of almost 70 years to live out the rest of me life in the faraway country of America. I sailed for me own life and for me family's future. Oh, my sons and my daughters, well, they were all I had. What future did I have to look forward to, you see? I needed to live where we could work and eat and be free of starvation and poverty. Oh, of course, if you do the math, you see I was one of the oldest immigrants on the ship. At 66, I was in good health and I had escaped. Oh, that voyage took 49 days and we went into the lowest part of the ship called steerage. It was a rough trip, but I arrived on America's shores to begin the next chapter in the book of me life. And although I left a teary goodbye at me husband's grave, I knew he would want me to live and he would want me to see our children be well. We arrived in America at the port of New Orleans, and then we sailed up the long Mississippi to arrive in St. Louis, Missouri. Oh, to be sure, I took in the difference between this new country and me home village of Cashel. America was, as Patrick's letters told us, but no one could imagine it without seeing it all. Oh, there were great steamships, towns set right upon the river, brick 2- and 3-story buildings and smokestacks. There were soft hills, and the river was wide and long like our Shannon. Oh, but the towns and the factories, well, they had me eyes wide. But the real difference between the two, that there was no starvation. There were many other things being different to me, of course. The land in St. Louis was green, oh, but it was not so green as me homeland. St. Louis was busy with busy roads and lots of buildings, more being built every day. I took a deep breath and I went forward. The land in America had gotten rain, but I was missing the Irish constant soft rain. The rainbows here were few and far between. But at this point in me life, I didn't mind because you see, I had life. I had me children. We had life and we had food. The blessing of it all was food and land to own ourselves. Of course, the best of it all was to be together again, to see my Patrick again, strong and well in America. But the best of it all, the blessing of life, well, that was enough food. So that's Margaret and her voice. And I was privileged to be able to tell you that because I think that many of our ancestors came from that story. So just to let you know that Margaret's son Patrick is pictured here, and he ended up marrying Hannah, and they moved to San Francisco. I got the record of Patrick from stories of soldiers and battles. He was in the Civil War, and I believe that's why he moved to San Francisco in 1864 after living in Muscatine, Iowa. He'd seen enough of the war and he wanted to have a new opportunity. His brother was living out here in the city as well. City directories are an incredible source of where people lived, and they tell you lots and lots of information about what people did, their addresses and their names, and phone books. People had, well, of course, in 1864, they didn't have phone books, but later on, the phone books will tell you a lot. So these are my great-great-grandparents, Patrick and Anna, and they lived in the city. They began, their offspring, my grandmother, began their life in the city, and I could find pictures from the UC Bancroft Library. It's an incredible source of dated photos. And as I said before, the city directories for each year are easy to acquire. So here's where they came. I believe, I might be wrong, but this could be the Hibernia Bank, which I know many Irish people subscribe to that bank. And of course, there were no cars when they lived here. And you can see the ferry building, and there's Market Street. I always loved being in Market Street because I just knew that my grandparents walked there. And this is the same Market Street that you and I walk now. The San Francisco city directories, they'll let you search for the names, addresses, and businesses from the years 1850 to the 1960s. And you can see that I put in their names Anson, and it came up. It's an incredible source. You can get the tone of the businesses, what was there in the city, their addresses, and that's just easy information to find. And I'll send you those websites as well. But yeah, they'll give you, what page they're on and what they did. Those are incredible sources. So Patrick and Anna's first daughter, her name was Marie Louise Smith, and she had a very hard start to her life. And then she had a great success in her life. And my grandmother Lottie was born in 1884 from the marriage of Marie Anson Smith to Garrett Smith, who you see here in this picture. Now, Garrett Smith was a very well-to-do farmer in the Delta in Ireland. And so I was able to research that history too in the Sacramento Delta. But my grandmother, Marie Louise Anson Smith, as I mentioned, had a hard start to her early life. She was married to a man named Benjamin Garrett. Well, it turns out that Benjamin Garrett and she had my grandmother, Lottie, in 1884, but it turns out that he was indeed a bigamist, and he ran off and left her single mom with one daughter. Well, I found the unfortunate publication of the Chronicle for one of the years, I guess it was in 1886. And the Chronicle summarized at the end of the year all the divorces in the city, which were 365 divorces at that time. And it said, Marie Louise Smith, no, sorry, Marie Louise, yeah, because his name was Smith. Marie Louise divorced from Garrett, from Benjamin Garrett. I always get their names mixed up, sorry, because her first husband's name was Benjamin Garrett. Her second husband's name was Garrett Smith. Anyway, Marie Louise divorced from Benjamin Garrett, and the reason was extreme cruelty. Now that would have been extraordinarily hard for her to have that published in the paper, but legally they had to do it. Anyway, she had a hard start, but then she had a great success because she was a seamstress and she met Garrett Smith. He lived up on the Delta. My mother and I actually took some license because we imagined that because she was a seamstress, she may have sewn clothes for him and his family, and that's how they met. We didn't really know how they met. So sometimes when you're writing, if you're writing stories like I did, you take some license and you hope that you were right. But my grandmother, Charlotte, lived on the Delta with Marie Louise and Garrett, and then they had 3 more children. How did I research this part of the book is that I actually visited the Delta towns. They lived in Rio Vista, and I also visited the town of Lok, or Laki, the Chinese people call it Laki. That is the Chinese part of the area, because the people at that time were segregated, and the Chinese people had to go to segregated schools. The people in the white people had their own schools, and so it was very segregated. And in doing this research, I learned a lot about history and the reality of those times, which sometimes mirrors the reality of our own times. You see here that I put the asparagus in because Garrett Smith was, my mother told me that Garrett Smith was probably one of the first to plant asparagus in California. And you also see a picture here of the Delta Queen, that people rode it back and forth all the time. And it was quite the thing. My mom told me that she and her mother, when my mom was little, she and her mother would pay the fare and ride up. They would start at 5 o'clock in the evening in San Francisco, and they would arrive at 5 in the morning in the Delta to visit my grandmother's family. But also here you see a picture of the Chong family. They actually ended up buying this house here, which is Garrett Smith's brother's house on the Delta, because my grandfather and his brother actually went out of business during the Depression. So I thought it was an interesting historical fact that the Chong family had bought this house and they lived in it for many years. I was able to access this photo by the permission of that family, and also the families of people who live in various places will have websites. And if you just put in their names, you'll find out. And people are very eager to share. And also I visited the Delta towns, and I went on river cruises through the Rhodes Scholar. The Rhodes Scholar offered a great river cruise, and that was a wonderful way to experience the life that my great grandparents and my grandmother had in those times. I did audit college courses. We have in Santa Cruz the ability to audit college courses, and I talked to professors about what went on. So that was a great time. So now Lottie moves to the city. So she moved here in 1902. And this part I'll just read to you. You can see the ferry building here. And this is actually a pretty good reflection of the times or the year when she went. You can see there's the Delta steamships going back and forth, and they've got the streetcars, and they've got horse and buggy. Now, at that time, there were no cars. So just to give you a little history on the ferry building, that 1850s to the 1940s, Steamships ran regularly from the Sacramento to San Francisco, delivering passengers and produce and mail and goods back and forth from the 1850s all the way until the 1940s. In the early 1850s, I found records for the ferry building. And of course, I'd visited there many times, and I bet you have too, to get the feel of the place which had been used for a terminal since the early 1850s. And the current ferry building that we have now was built in 1898. It withstood the earthquake and it was fine. So in the 1930s, before the 1930s, travel by ferry was the only way that people could get to the city from the North or the East Bay. At one time, an average, now this is an interesting fact, an average of 50,000 people a day commuted by ferry. And let's see, the last part I can't see, but let's see. Oh yeah, so now my daughter, Katie Sanchez, who I mentioned, she's in Panama. She'll read from the book and from the chapter that's called Lottie Moves to the City, 1902. And so Katie, are you ready?
Okay, yes, hi.
Okay, so yeah, Katie's, and you can see the picture as she reads and just imagine that you're there.
Right. Lottie Smith, August 1902. Lottie stepped from the ferry boat that summer day in 1902, ready for the world. Her trunks were packed for a long stay. The oil paintings and charcoal drawings from her time at St. Gertrude's were stored back in Ileton. Her graduation medal for elocution was tucked safely away for this journey, wrapped in the handkerchiefs her mother hand embroidered for her. She was 18 years old, sure of herself and set firm with her decision to live in the city with Aunt Amy and Uncle Joe. Lottie's red hair blew in the morning, while the city's foghorn sounded deep into the misty air. She and her mother, Marie Louise, scanned the crowd at the back of the newly built ferry building looking for Aunt Amy's horse and buggy. Amy, Amy, here we are! Aunt Amy waved her handkerchief high while her husband Joe nickered the horses toward their favorite niece. Lottie ran, her long city dress flowing behind her. Aunt Amy, Uncle Joe, the ride was lovely. The dolphins greeted us when we got to the shore. Do you have my room ready? How many other boarders are there? Can I really cook during the day and go to the theater at night? Slow down, Lottie, all things in good time, Amy said, as Joe urged the team toward home. They trotted past City Hall and into the familiar neighborhood. When they reached the 3-story boarding house, Lottie sighed and breathed in deeply. Aunt Amy, this is my life now, here in San Francisco. As she stepped off Amy's buggy that Sunday morning, one of Amy's boarders reached for her trunk. I'm Philip, he announced. Lottie Smith. I know, he said. He carried her trunk easily up the stairs to the second-floor room fixed up just for her. Their courtship lasted 7 months. Philip Lynch was 26 years old and had grown up in Brentwood on the east side of the Delta. Philip's parents, Ellen and Philip Lynch, had immigrated from Ireland and owned a large farm where Phil had grown up. He'd lived in the city for 6 years and now showed Lottie San Francisco. They rode horses out to Ocean Beach and went swimming at Sutro Baths. They took Philip's horses, all brass-trimmed buggy, all over town, up hills and down and into the forest at Lake Merced. Philip had the valet at the Hotel Majestic park the buggy around the back when they would go for an after-theater dinner. Philip had come to San Francisco to take over his Uncle Pat's hay, grain, and coal business, which was now going well. He had the means to court Lottie in an elegant manner. All those years at St. Gertrude's Academy had schooled her in the fine arts of dining, tea, oil painting, and of course, the theater. Lottie tried to hold tight to her dreams of acting and elocution, but she was so taken by the stars in Philip's eyes that her dreams of a starring role in the theater subsided for a time. They were married February 22nd, 1903 at St. Dominic's Church on the corner of Bush and Steiner. All their family came to the city. Lottie's parents, Garrett and Marie Louise, along with her sisters and brothers, made the sail downriver from Ileton. Philip's parents and several of his 11 brothers and sisters arrived from Brentwood. Patrick and Anna Anson, Lottie's grandparents, who had first come to San Francisco from Muscatine, Iowa, almost 40 years before, were happy to attend the wedding of their firstborn granddaughter. Marie Louise sewed Lottie's beautiful light blue wedding gown by hand. They hired a photographer to capture the moment. The hills and vistas of San Francisco were now home to the next generation, the beautiful young couple, Charlotte Smith Lynch and Philip Lynch. Philip and Lottie took the train to Santa Cruz for a grand honeymoon. They enjoyed the boardwalk and the shops on Pacific Avenue while staying at the St. George Hotel. On their way to Santa Cruz, they spent one night in San Jose because Lottie was eager to see The Little Duchess at the Victory Theater. It was a musical potpourri featuring the famous French singer Anna Held, presented by the New York producer Florin Ziegfeld Jr. This fabulous international production featured specially designed evening gowns and hats selected by Mr. Ziegfeld in Paris. Lottie loved the extravaganza and found that her dream of acting on the stage remained vibrant and alive. Philip, too, was taken by the production's splendor. He saw his new wife safely tuck the theater program titled Figaro in her suitcase and later paste it in her scrapbook, rekindling her love for the theater, which would continue for the rest of her life.
Okay, Katie, thank you so much. That was a very good reading. Perfect, thanks. And so that would be Katie's great-great-grandmother. And my grandmother did actually save the Figaro program and in her scrapbook. And so I knew that had some significance for her because she did want to become an actress, but she ended up having 7 kids and her plans had to change. And my mom told me that her mom did sew my grandmother's wedding dress. And so I was happy to be able to share that. And now we will go on with the rest. I'm trying to find my cursor here. Emily, I lost my cursor. Oh, there it is. Okay, here we go. Okay. So they had a happy marriage, and they did have a happy marriage for 50 years. And there's the wedding dress and my young looking grandmother and grandfather, Philip and Charlotte. I knew them. Up until I was 5, my grandfather ended up living with us, and I think that he was my first friend and maybe I was his last friend, and they were just wonderful people. But here, this is a story of that my grandmother saved in her scrapbook. And it tells that she did recall this terrible train wreck. It says, Mrs. Lynch remembered that 3 months after they were married, they were in a railroad wreck near Point Reyes, and the prospects of ever celebrating a 50th anniversary were dim indeed. So I'd heard this. I told you that I found the newspaper article, and I was thinking to myself, why were they on that train? Was it a picnic train that sometimes people went from San Francisco up into Marin and up into Occidental and Sonoma County? There was only one car and I couldn't figure that out. So I felt like a junior Sherlock Holmes, and I went to the Tomales Bay Public Library, and it's a small little library in Tomales Bay. They actually had a little section on trains. I opened a book and there was the fact that on June 21st, 1903, there was a terrible train wreck, and it was because people were on the single car for coming home from the funeral of Warren Dutton, who was the European founder of Tomales. I thought, well, how did they know Warren Dutton? And it turns out that my grandmother, Charlotte Lottie's father, was a dredger. And so he worked for Warren Dutton because Warren Dutton had to dredge out the Tomales Bay in order to ship his produce. So that made me feel good. But sometimes when you do these histories, you're going to have to look in unusual places. And if you can get to those places, that's really fun. So this is the big newspaper that my grandmother had saved. And you can see that at that time there was photography, and there was also some line drawings of this terrible train wreck. But my grandparents were young, and I figured that's why they survived. They were in their early 20s. And so they had, some PTSD from that. And I wrote the story from both my grandmother's and my grandfather's point of view. So that was one part of history that they were in. Well, they did recover from the train wreck, but then in April of 1906 came the big earthquake in San Francisco that happened out off of Daly City over by the Farallones. And entered into San Francisco with a big shock. I can't remember exactly the number, but it was big. And my family and I had experienced just recently, well, not so recently, but in 1989, the earthquake in Santa Cruz. So I did have some prior experience to a big earthquake. Um, but I knew that several facts about my grandparents. I knew that they lived at Third and Clement. My mom had told me they had one 2-year-old son, their firstborn son, Walter. I knew that my grandma had to cook outside because people did that. And I also knew that my grandpa had a team of horses and that he did rescue work. So the papers did publish a couple days after, or maybe a day after the earthquake. And you can see that it's the Call, Examiner, and Chronicle. They all folded together and said, okay, we're going to get this out. The city hall was actually in ruins. It was built very shabbily at that time. It had to be rebuilt. Of course, you can recognize the dome that's there. But unfortunately, many of the city records from the city hall were just gone prior to 1906. So you're not going to be able to find those things there, but you will be able to find things other places. So let's see here. There we go. The site OpenSF History has lots and lots of images that you'll be able to access. And here is one team of horses, and they are doing rescue work. You can see the buildings in the background. I'm not sure what neighborhood this is, but there are many sites that will give you addresses, and you can put your address in and they will reflect what was going on in those times. This is a kitchen, group of kitchens outside. The women are cooking. And I couldn't find my grandmother's photographs of her actual stove and cooking and her photographs of the earthquake because she gave them to her oldest daughter, Camilla. Well, Camilla wasn't an historian like my mother was, and she thought, well, nobody is going to be interested in this. I'll give these to the Goodwill. So much to my heartbreak, that did happen. But as I say, you can find images in other places, and all the women had to cook outside because they couldn't get the gas from the city, and that lasted well into the summer. Also, I was very interested to find this site, and I'll send it to you too. It's the Sanborn Fire Insurance Map, and they have images of every building in San Francisco. It was quite incredible for me to see that my grandfather's livery and livery stable was here, and also that the I can't really read that, but it's the hay grain and coal yard. And my grandfather had a hay grain and coal business, and he kept horses in the livery stable. Now, if you go on Eddy and Larkin, at 610 Larkin is where they were. 610 Larkin now, interestingly enough, is the site of the PG&E building, which I thought was a good connection because he had the hay grain and coal, which kept the people in energy at that time. And then PG&E does that for us now. But that's an incredible site. And I was very happy, and it's just fascinating to find that. Here's a bigger picture of it. So this was my grandfather's hay grain and coal yard. And then here's the livery stable. And one thing I had the advantage of is my brother Pat lives in the city. He's born in the city. He's lived in the city for many years. He and I toured the addresses that we found from the phone books of where my grandparents lived. And so he gave me his perspective on, what was happening. And since they lived on Third and Clement in the Richmond, he said, well, Jeannie, I think that probably Grandpa would have had to go up Laurel Street Hill to overlook the downtown and see what was happening downtown. And of course, they saw the beginnings of those fires. But he said, I think he would have had to go check on his horses. So that's what I wrote about when I wrote about my grandfather. And then also people, not my relatives, but other people I know, their relatives did camp out in Golden Gate Park. And here's the pictures of the tents in the park. And the people lived through that. And I think one of the things that I've learned, especially for us in these times, is that people live through hard times, and they did it, and we can do it. So it gives me heart to know that they had good times, and they also had really hard times that they lived through. That was my next point, is that to know the past, that helps us with our own times. And I think it will help my children, my grandchildren, to know, okay, they did it. We can do it. We can do it. I was able to get my grandfather Philip's draft card. He had to see 2 world wars. He had to register for the draft, but he had the 7 kids, so he didn't have to go in the army. A couple of his sons did have to go into the army, and they all came out. They all survived, but they also had a really hard time. My grandparents went through a quarantine. They had scarlet fever in their family. One of their children passed away from it. And so I did write about that. And I thought to myself, how can I start this chapter about my Uncle Russell? And the first sentence that came to me was, we all knew we have another uncle and his name is Russell. And so I wanted to tell that story. The people did live through quarantines, and theirs was shorter than ours is, but they survived. Well, after that, my grandfather actually, unfortunately, went bankrupt through no fault of his own. He had hired a bookkeeper named Hennessy, what they say is he stole from the till. When he went back to his place after the earthquake, Hennessy had stolen from the till. I'm sorry, after the quarantine, because my grandfather and grandmother were quarantined in their house for a full 2 months. He couldn't go into work. So Hennessy had been stealing from the till. He went back after the quarantine and had nothing. So he thought, okay, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? Well, he had grown up in Brentwood in the East Bay on a farm. His Irish grandmother and grandfather had come there and bought the 100 acres in Brentwood for 25 cents an acre. They farmed that place. And some of the Lynch kids are in here in this picture. And they went to a 1-room schoolhouse in Brentwood. My uncles loved it. My grandmother hated it. She had been in the city. She was used to a very nice life, and she had to cook and clean, and they had to get water from a water truck and put it in a cistern, and just really, really hard life. But my uncles will tell this story about the time they had their Wild West rodeo show. And I'll read you a little bit from that story. So you can imagine some of these kids getting up to no good in their rodeo show in Brentwood in 1919. And this is a story that involves my Uncle Walter, Phil, Don, and Jack, and my Aunt Camilla. So here we go. We'll read you a little story now. A favorite family story is about one of the greatest times in my uncles and aunt had staging a self-made rodeo. Philip and Lottie decided that Walter was old enough at 15 to watch over their brood while they went off to the real rodeo in Antioch. Phil Jr., age 12, Donald, age 8, and Jack, age 6, were left blissfully alone with only their oldest brother, Walter, and Camilla, the wise 10-year-old sister, to rein them in. Let's have our own rodeo right here in the corral, Phil Jr. suggested when his parents were out of sight. Yeah, that's a swell idea, Don chimed in. I could be the bucking bronco rider. No, Walter explained calmly. I will be the rodeo master. You 3 will be the cowboys. We'll have racehorses and roping. It will be swell. At this point, Walt couldn't see any harm in this idea. After all, they'd been living on the farm for 3 years already, and the kids knew the animals well. Let's get going. What'll I do, Walt? Asked 6-year-old Jack. Oh, we'll figure that out later, said Walt. Meanwhile, Jack, you and Don get the ropes out. Start practicing. Phil and I will get the horses saddled up. Don chimed in. Jack and I, we could do tricks with the dogs. Maybe we could light a hoop on fire so the dogs can go through. Now, wait a minute. No fire, demanded Camilla, who was listening carefully to the whole plan. She was the 3rd oldest, and as she'd gotten into trouble the least amount of times, her point of view did carry some weight. You remember what happened when Don and Jack set that fire near the creek, and our dog Shep, he was tied to the post last summer? We all caught it from Dad that time. No fires. Absolutely no fire, Walter glared at his 3 younger brothers. I'm the rodeo master. This whole show, nobody gets into trouble. Nothing stupid. Got it? Don, Phil, and Jack nodded their heads. Camilla pointed at the brothers. That's right, no fires. I'll take the tickets. I think the neighbors will want to come. She fluffed up her red curls. I'll wear my new boots and sparkly shirt. I'll ride around the corral on Daisy's back. She's the prettiest horse and tame. You boys, you put on kerchiefs like real cowboys. Comb your hair, and even Jack. What do we call ourselves? The Lynch Wild Breast Rodeo Show. Today, only 2 cents admission, Phil commanded. Camilla, take Jack around the Williamsons' place. The Pruitts, the Cakebreads, and the Schallenbergs. Those kids will all come. Camilla chimed in. Well, we can't let them have any food. Mom'll notice. Oh, no food, no fair, cried the younger boys. No food. This will be after lunch anyway. We'll have to make everything right in the corral by nightfall when Mom and Dad come home. Everything will be back to normal. And you'll find out what happens to my uncles and aunt when you read the book. But that was fun because I'd heard that story all my life. So that was fun to write about. And I actually asked my cousin, who's alive now, because my uncles had been all passed away. Well, can you tell me your version of the story? And so he told me his. So I kind of pieced it together from what I'd heard. Anyway, my grandparents did not do as well in Brentwood as they would have liked to. So they got the idea that they should own a silent movie theater in the city. And they went back to the city, and they did. They were silent movie operators in San Francisco. I think it was 1922. And Charlie Chaplin and all kinds, let's see, I can't remember the name, Harold Lloyd. They were the performers, and they had 7 kids. So they put their kids to work. My Uncle Jack ran the projector. My Aunt Minnie and Uncle Phil played the player piano, and they all had jobs. And my grandfather was just getting to the idea that maybe he should sell popcorn and have little treats in the theater, because people didn't do that at that time. One of the ways that I was happy to get my research from was that we have a professor at UC Santa Cruz who is a professor of silent movies. And she gave a class, and I went and talked to her. And so she gave me some facts that I didn't know before. But down the bottom, you can see that there's the gem, and that was a real theater. It's at the bottom right, I believe. It was a great venture. However, unfortunately, the gem burned, and that was rough for them. And they did recover, but my Uncle Phil tells the story that he went down from his elementary school, and it was his job to get the films every week, because they changed the films every week. And so he went down to get the films. He came back, and he told me this himself. He said, I was on the streetcar, and the streetcar operator says, Phil, your theater's gone. And it was. And so they had hard luck again, but they did recover, and they went through the Great Depression. My grandfather worked all his life, and he was actually a special policeman in the city for the part of the Golden. Sorry, I'm losing my. What's the park in the city? Golden Gate Park. Yeah, he was special policeman for the Panhandle in Golden Gate Park. So they recovered. And they never gave up. They showed strength and goodness all their lives. And I was very happy to be able to put this into a book. The book actually took me about 10 years. So, just keep on keeping on with your research. And I had the privilege of having my mother live with us in Santa Cruz in the same town. For the last 10 years of her life. She lived until she was 97. So I could bring the stories to her, and I could say, do you think I got it? And she'd say, yeah, I think you did. So that was a good part of what I did. And I'm trying to find my cursor here. Let's see here. And I think, I wanted to let you know that here they are in their later life. There's Philip and Charlotte and their children with their spouses. There's my mom and my dad, and there's me, and there's my brother Pat, and my sister Sue, and all my cousins. And so they had 12 grandchildren and many more great and great-great-grandchildren. And we have a little Dean Patrick here, who's probably in the next room. So I wrote the book to let them see that, their people live through some times. And this is one of my favorite pictures, my grandfather and myself at Christmas. And like I say, he was one of my first friends, and I was happy to get to know them. So thank you so much for listening to my story, and I appreciate you being here. And if you have questions, I'd be glad to answer them. I'm not sure how that's going to go, Emmy, in terms of how I would hear the people. Okay, so if anybody has questions, you can ask them and I can hear you.
Thank you, Jean. That was wonderful. So everyone, you're welcome to unmute as you have questions, or you can submit your question in the chat and I'll keep an eye on that and relay the question that way.
Hi, Jean. This is Valerie McGrew. I don't have a question, but I want to say hello. I met you when you did the presentation in the Maine Irish Center a few years ago.
Mm-hmm. Right. Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. It's nice to see you. Yeah. Thanks for attending.
I worked with your brother Pat, so I don't know.
Right.
If you remember that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was a wonderful presentation, though. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you could come.
Hi, Jean, this is Patty Trackman. I'm one of the co-coordinators.
Right.
It's nice to see you kind of in person. For anybody else that's contemplating doing this kind of a project and getting it published, I was wondering if you have reached out to various genealogical societies or other archives to donate copies of your book so that your family history is accessible in, like research centers. I mean, it's a great book.
Yeah, thanks. I have, the internet is an incredible source of, you put in Irish genealogy in the United States. And so I have done that. Now with the pandemic going on, a lot of our communications are virtual or, on the internet. So I think once people start getting vaccinated and this opens up more, I think getting a real book will be more accessible. So thanks. I have done some of that, and I will do more. Also, I have a friend who works at Foothill College in Los Altos, and she recommended that the colleges have the book too. So I'm going to do that.
Yeah, I wondered if you had thought about reaching out to the Daughters of the American Revolution library in Washington, DC. I had the opportunity to visit there a couple of years ago and was really pleasantly surprised at how many regional sources that they had copies of.
Okay, good.
Yeah, because it felt like it was like one-stop shopping. If you've got people in New York, San Francisco, Chicago, they had resources developed by their members as well as collected by their members. And, that would be another place to maybe sell your book or donate a copy.
And I'm going to jump in on that note. We do have a question in the chat as well, but the Dowling Library does hold a copy of Jean's book. And Jean, if they don't yet, you might consider the Sutro Library. They have an extensive genealogical collection.
Oh, really?
Your book would be right up their alley.